In this world, your destiny is not a choice. It is a calculation. The moment you emerge into the light, the system marks you. It assigns a rank, a number etched into the core of your existence, defining your worth, your path, and your ultimate end. This is the bedrock of civilization. Below 1,000, you are a laborer, a gear in the machine, fueling the industry of the world. From 1,000 to 99,999, you are a cultivator, granted the power to bend the elements to your will. Above them, the immortals ascend, reaching toward the heavens, until you reach the summit. There, the millionth rank belongs to the celestial lords. They sit in their high citadels, the architects of a reality that never shifts. There is no social mobility. There is no deviation. The system is ancient, unyielding, and absolute. It governs every breath, every movement, and every heartbeat. The hierarchy is the law, and the law is the cage. For 400 years, no soul has ever questioned the math. The world remains still. In the year 402 of the era of calibration, the capital city of Oros stood silent. At the center of the plaza, the monolith rose like a jagged tooth of obsidian, its surface dark and dormant. Thousands gathered in the square, their eyes fixed on the stone. They knew the ritual. They had seen it 1,000 times before. A young man walked toward the base of the structure. His footsteps clicked against the stone, the only sound in a sea of thousands. He reached the designated mark and stopped. The crowd held its breath. The air grew thick, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that rattled teeth and made the skin crawl. The system began its cycle. A faint, rhythmic pulse of light flickered deep within the obsidian, casting long, shifting shadows. The machine initiated the scan. It reached into his essence, searching for a classification. The pressure in the air reached a breaking point. The monolith pulsed, a blinding white light bleeding from its core. The scan intensified, the frequency of the hum shifting into a rapid, erratic staccato. The display surface rippled like water under a gale. It cycled through digits, flashing numbers at a speed the human eye could barely track. 100, 5,000, 900,000. The machine was hunting, searching for a match, a label, a home for this soul. Then, the light snapped to a halt. The white glare vanished, replaced by a single hollow symbol carved in glowing ink against the black stone, a 0. The display did not flicker. It did not shift. It held the shape with a terrifying, static permanence. The piercing whine of the monolith cut out instantly. The thousands in the plaza stood frozen, their mouths slightly parted, eyes locked on the glowing mark. No one spoke. No one moved. The wind died down, and even the distant city noise seemed to vanish, swallowed by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. The boys stood motionless. The silence was not merely quiet. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute, pressing down on every person in the square like a physical weight. The silence shattered. It did not end with a shout or a scream, but with a deep, grinding groan that erupted from the base of the monolith. The obsidian surface began to crack, thin veins of white light spiderwebbing across the black stone. A low-frequency vibration rippled outward, traveling through the plaza floor and up into the souls of every person standing there. The ground shuddered. Dust rose from the cracks in the pavement, swirling in the sudden, erratic gusts of wind. High above, the sky flickered. The global network was failing. In the control centers of Oros, alarms began to wail, a dissonant chorus of warnings. The system was initiating an emergency reboot. It was a desperate, automated response to an error it could not compute. The monolith hummed, then shrieked, the sound of metal grinding against metal echoing. Every screen in the city went dark, then surged with static. The foundation of the world was fracturing. The reboot had begun, and the world was changing. The world operated on a scale of absolute value. Ranks 1 through 999 were the mortals, the laborers whose lives were measured by the output of the machine. Above them, ranks 1,000 to 99,000. 999 were the cultivators, individuals who could bend the elements to their will. Higher still, the immortals reached toward the heavens, and at the absolute summit, the millionth rank belonged to the celestial lords. Every soul had a place. Every life had a ceiling. The system ensured that no one drifted, no one exceeded their assigned potential, and no one escaped the grid. But the boy with the 0 rank stood outside this architecture. He was not a laborer, not a cultivator, and certainly not a lord. He was a ghost in the machine. While the system dictated the worth and path of every other living being, it found no data to process when it scanned him. He existed in the blind spot of a global network. By lacking a rank, he possessed no assigned destiny. He was not merely at the bottom of the ladder, he was not on the ladder at all. He remained still, watching the monolith, a singular, unclassifiable anomaly drifting through a landscape built on the very laws he had just rendered obsolete. He traveled north, seeking answers within the ancient halls of the high sex. The northern peaks were bastions of tradition. When he reached the main gate, the guards did not ask for his name. They scanned his essence, expecting a rank. The device in the guard's hand pulsed, then went dead. The scan failed. Word spread through the inner sanctums with unnatural speed. The sect masters emerged, their faces hardening as they sensed the anomaly. They did not see a seeker. They saw a contagion. The air around the gate began to hum with the activation of defensive wards. Heavy bronze gates groaned, swinging shut. He stepped forward, raising a hand to explain, but the air itself turned hostile. A barrier of shimmering energy slammed into existence. The elders stood on the ramparts, their eyes cold and distant. They spoke no words of judgment, only the silence of absolute exclusion. He stood alone on the frozen slope, watching the gates remain locked. The path behind him was closed, and the path ahead remained a void. Driven by the need for purpose, he turned toward the capital's military district. The Imperial Army was the final authority on order, a massive institution that processed thousands of recruits daily. He stood in the long, disciplined queue, waiting for his turn at the registration desk. The officer behind the terminal did not look up, his fingers dancing across a haptic interface. He reached for the boy's wrist to initiate the mandatory rank sync. The terminal screen flickered, then turned a violent, pulsing red. A high-pitched, discordant alarm shrieked through the recruitment hall, silencing the chatter of hundreds of soldiers. The officer recoiled, his hand hovering over a panic button. "A fundamental error," the officer muttered, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. The system could not verify him, and therefore, the army could not enlist him. He was not a soldier. He was a glitch in the ledger of the state. Two heavy-set guards stepped forward, their movements synchronized and devoid of hesitation. They escorted him to the outer perimeter and shoved him past the heavy iron bollards. The gates hissed shut, sealing the military compound behind a wall of impenetrable, electrified steel. He stood on the edge of the paved road, the sound of the city fading into a distant, indifferent hum. He was now entirely alone, stripped of any institutional tether, cast into the silence of his own unclassifiable existence. The wilderness of the borderlands offered no shelter, only the biting wind and the vast, uncaring expanse of stone. He sat on a jagged ridge, his mind replaying the rejection of the sects and the army. He reached inward, seeking the familiar anchor of the system, the invisible tether that dictated his potential and capped his growth. He pushed his energy, expecting the standard resistance, the hard wall that defined the limits of a mortal soul. Nothing. There was no resistance, no ceiling, no feedback loop to throttle his progress. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs as the implications took hold. He tried again, channeling a surge of raw force into his palm. It did not dissipate or hit a regulatory barrier. It expanded, fluid and unchecked. The air around his hand rippled, not with the controlled precision of a cultivator, but with a chaotic, surging intensity. He was not just unranked, he was unconstrained. He looked at the horizon, his breath hitching as he understood the danger. He was a ghost in the machine, and for the first time, he felt the true, heavy weight of absolute freedom. He focused on a heavy stone resting at the edge of the cliff. In this world, mass was a constant, a value the system enforced with absolute rigidity. He reached out, not with the practiced technique of a cultivator, but with a raw, intent-driven pull. The stone did not just lift, it defied gravity, hovering in the air as if the laws of physics had simply ceased to apply to it. He flicked his wrist, and the stone accelerated, tearing through the air at a speed that should have shattered it into dust. Instead, it remained whole, moving with a fluid, impossible grace. He took a step forward, and the ground beneath his feet did not yield. It hardened, responding to his will rather than the geological pressure of the earth. He turned his attention to a massive granite boulder, a relic of the ancient mountains. He struck it with a palm, channeling his energy not into the surface, but into the molecular bonds, holding the rock together. The boulder did not crack. It dissolved into fine sand, the energy output far exceeding the theoretical maximum allowed for any ranked being. He watched the dust settle, his pulse steady, his mind clear. The world was a construct of rules, and he had just learned how to rewrite them. The borderlands stretched out in a blur of gray dust and jagged obsidian. As he walked, he stopped focusing on his own power and began to watch the world itself. He noticed the way the light flickered at the edge of his vision, a rhythmic stutter in the horizon that mirrored the pulse of the system. It was a glitch, a momentary failure in the rendering of reality. He knelt, pressing his hand into the dry earth, and felt the vibration of the global network beneath the surface. It was not a smooth flow of data. It was a patchwork of forced logic, riddled with seams. He tracked these seams across the landscape, finding that they all converged on his own path. The patterns were too precise to be random. He watched a cluster of clouds freeze in midair, then snap forward as if correcting a calculation error. He was the catalyst for these failures. Every time he moved, the environment struggled to categorize him, creating these localized distortions. He traced the lines of the glitch with his fingers, seeing the underlying code of the world fraying under his presence. The realization settled in his mind, cold and absolute. His zero rank was not an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated anomaly, forged with intent. He was a variable inserted into the system to test its limits. He pushed deeper into the wastes until the dust gave way to the skeletal remains of the first city. Massive pillars of obsidian lay shattered, half buried in the shifting sands. He walked through the silence, his boots crunching on fragments of a civilization that predated the current order. He stopped before a sunken archway, the stone etched with symbols that seemed to vibrate as he approached. He cleared the debris, his hands scraping away layers of calcified grit to reveal a sealed chamber. Inside, the walls were covered in intricate, glowing carvings. These were not the sterile binary lines of the system. He traced the inscriptions with his fingertips, feeling a hum of energy that bypassed his skin and resonated directly in his marrow. He was not a glitch. He was a construct, forged by a power that viewed the current system as a temporary experiment. The chamber walls pulsed with a rhythmic, golden light that seemed to draw breath from his own lungs. He stood motionless, the inscriptions burning into his memory. The text was clear now. He was not a byproduct of a system error, but a deliberate focal point for a total collapse. The architect had built him to be the final variable, the one element that could trigger a complete system reset. He looked at his hands, seeing them not as flesh, but as tools of an ancient, forgotten design. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His journey was no longer about avoiding the hunters or surviving the wastes. It was about reaching the core. The purpose was cataclysmic. He was meant to dismantle the very foundation of the world, to shatter the hierarchy that had defined human existence for 400 years. A low, grinding sound echoed through the ruins as the chamber floor shifted, aligning with his presence. He felt the weight of 1,000 years of planning pressing against his consciousness. The fear he had carried since the monolith in Oros evaporated, replaced by a cold, singular clarity. He was the key. He stepped out of the chamber, the ruins falling silent behind him. He walked toward the edge of the borderlands, testing the limits of his influence. He reached out toward a shimmering, static-filled barrier that marked the boundary of the sector. It was a wall of pure, enforced logic. He did not ask it to open. He willed it to cease. His fingers pressed against the air, and the space between them fractured like glass. A shockwave of distorted light rippled outward, tearing through the digital fabric of the horizon. The ground beneath him groaned, the very soil struggling to maintain its programmed density. He watched as the ripple expanded. Every barrier he touched shattered with a high-pitched, metallic whine that echoed for miles. The system, was no longer ignoring him. Far to the north, the sky began to bleed static, a direct response to the structural damage he had inflicted. He had become a tear in the tapestry. He took another step, and the ground buckled. The order was fraying. He was rewriting it with every movement. High above the clouds, within the silent, sterile citadels of the celestial lords, the air itself began to hum with a discordant frequency. For millennia, the hierarchy had remained a stagnant, perfect reflection of the system's will. Now, that perfection fractured. A ripple of raw, unformatted data washed over the spires, causing the white stone to flicker and lose its density. The lords sat in their high halls, their eyes snapping open as the fundamental laws they commanded started to fray. They felt the disturbance not as a sound, but as a sudden, sharp absence of control. The absolute order was being rewritten. One by one, they rose from their thrones, their movements synchronized and cold. They reached out with their consciousness. A zero had appeared in the equation, and it was expanding. The silence was replaced by a low, rhythmic vibration. The architects of the world finally turned their gaze toward the horizon, sensing the threat. The era of their dominance had reached its final hour. The hunters were not soldiers. They were lines of code given lethal intent, woven directly into the fabric of the world. They detached from the citadels like ink dropping into clear water, moving silently between the digital layers that defined reality. They did not walk. They skipped through space, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. In the borderlands, the boy felt the shift. The wind died, and the air turned brittle, crackling with the static of an impending strike. He stopped moving. He watched as a nearby rock formation flickered, its edges blurring into raw, unformatted data. Something was tracking his signature, carving a path through the landscape to find him. He crouched, pressing his palm against the cold, vibrating earth, and felt the rhythmic pulse of their approach. They were closing the distance, moving with a precision that ignored the laws of distance and time. He saw a shadow detach itself from a tree. He stood, his fingers tightening into fists, and braced for the first collision. The strike missed his shoulder by a fraction, the air tearing open where the blade had passed. He rolled, his boots finding purchase on the jagged, flickering ground. He did not run. Instead, he reached out and caught the edge of the distortion, the very point where the hunter had breached reality. His fingers sank into the cold, pulsing grid. A flood of information surged into his mind, bypassing his senses. He saw the world not as a landscape, but as a vast, interlocking lattice of constraints. Every living soul was a node. The system was not a foundation, it was a cage. He saw the laborers, the cultivators, and the lords, all trapped. He pulled his hand back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stood tall, his gaze locking onto the horizon, and he began to push back against the grid. He pushed his will against the invisible lattice. The ground beneath him groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that had no place in the natural order. Where he exerted pressure, the grass turned to ash, and the soil beneath cracked into geometric patterns that defied gravity. The hunters paused, their forms flickering violently as the local reality began to buckle under the strain of his defiance. He did not stop. He channeled the dissonance, forcing the grid to acknowledge his existence as a zero-sum variable. Above, the clouds started to bleed. The blue of the horizon drained away, replaced by a bruised, unnatural violet that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. The air grew thick, tasting of ozone and burnt metal. Birds fell from the canopy, their wings frozen in mid-flight as the local physics began to stutter and fail. The trees around him bent at impossible angles, their bark peeling away to reveal glowing metallic veins beneath. He looked up into the swirling, bruised expanse of the heavens, watching as the very fabric of the sky began to tear at the seams. The violet light deepened, turning the atmosphere into a suffocating shroud. Then, the silence was shattered. Every monolith in every city across the globe emitted a simultaneous, ear-splitting shriek. The sound was not organic. It was the voice of the machine in agony. Across the horizon, massive holographic projections flickered into existence. The text appeared in the air, burned into the retinas of every living soul. Anomaly detected. Reality, integrity at critical levels. The warning repeated, a rhythmic, pulsing command that shook the very foundation of the earth. He stood at the center of this collapse, his skin prickling as the ancient design began to exert its full force upon him. It was a physical pressure, a weight that felt like mountains. He gasped, his knees buckling as the gravity around him shifted, pulling him toward the center of the distortion. The machine had identified its error, and now it was preparing to purge the source of its own destruction. The warning text burned in the sky, but the world beneath it was already coming apart. The horizon line began to ripple like a disturbed pond. Miles away, the mountain range groaned, its peaks shearing off in jagged, impossible slabs that floated for a heartbeat before dissolving into streams of raw, glowing data. The ground beneath his feet turned fluid. Soil and bedrock vibrated with a high-pitched, mechanical shriek that tore through the silence of the wastes. It was the sound of the world's internal logic grinding to a halt. Every tremor sent shock waves of static through the air, causing the very light to stutter. He braced himself as the earth opened in long, clean fissures, revealing not stone but the pulsing golden circuitry of the underlying architecture. The vibration grew violent, throwing him off balance as the ground buckled in rhythmic, unnatural pulses. Trees snapped, not from wind, but because the space they occupied was being deleted. The air became a chaotic swirl of debris and flickering code. He watched as a nearby cliffside simply ceased to exist, replaced by a void that hummed with the same frequency as the global warning. The physical laws that had held the world together for millennia were fraying at the edges, unraveling into a frantic, incoherent mess of geometry and sound. The static coalesced. 6 figures detached themselves from the flickering air, their edges blurred by rapid, jagged oscillations. They moved without sound, sliding through the warped space like ink in water. The first hunter struck, a blade of pure, condensed light arcing toward his throat. He ducked, the heat of the strike singing his skin, and countered with a desperate palm strike. His hand passed through the hunter's chest, but where he made contact, the shadow's form shattered into a spray of corrupted pixels. The hunter shrieked and collapsed into a pile of useless, glowing debris. The remaining 5 lunged simultaneously. He didn't retreat. He stepped into the fray, his movements erratic, mirroring the glitches he created. Every time he touched a hunter, the digital fabric binding them snapped. He grabbed a limb, and the shadow dissolved into a swarm of white noise. He slammed his shoulder into another, and the impact sent a shockwave of code rippling across the clearing, tearing the hunter apart from the inside out. One by one, the shadows were reduced to flickering, dying sparks. He stood amidst the fading light, his hands glowing with raw, golden energy. The boy turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the high citadels hung, suspended in the violet sky. They were the pinnacle of the system, massive spires of white stone and gold that defied gravity. He began to walk. With every step, the air around him warped, creating a visible wake of distortion. As he approached the base of the floating capital, the first spire groaned. The sound was not of stone cracking, but of a massive file being corrupted. He reached out, his fingers grazing the outer wall of the primary citadel. The contact was instantaneous. The pristine surface rippled, then shattered into millions of tiny glowing squares. The white stone dissolved into streams of binary, falling away like sand in a high wind. He walked forward, and the architecture simply ceased to be. The grand gates of the Celestial Lords buckled, their intricate carvings melting into raw, unformatted data. He stepped through the threshold, and the floor beneath him turned to liquid light, then vanished entirely. Spires that had stood for millennia tilted, their foundations failing. He halted in the center of the Grand Plaza. Above him, the sky was no longer a canopy of clouds and light. It was a bruised, unnatural violet, tearing at the seams. The horizon flickered. Entire mountain ranges in the distance vanished and reappeared, struggling to maintain their coordinates. He looked at his own hands, still pulsing with the golden energy that had unmade the citadels. Was this the work of a savior? Or was he the final virus, the catalyst for the end of all things? The ground beneath his feet groaned, the bedrock itself failing to resolve its own existence. He watched as a nearby tower folded into itself, crushed by the weight of a reality that no longer had a foundation. If he stopped now, would the world stabilize, or was the collapse already irreversible? He took a breath, but the air tasted of ozone and static. Every movement he made sent a fresh tremor through the fabric of the world. He was the anomaly that had finally broken the cage, but the cage was the only thing holding the world together. He stood silent, watching the horizon dissolve into white noise. The choice was no longer his to make. He stepped forward, and the ground beneath him turned to dust. The chain reaction began in the capital. The central monolith, a towering pillar of obsidian, pulsed once, then erupted in a blinding, white-hot glare. It was not a fire, but a release of raw, uncompressed energy. Across the globe, from the industrial zones to the remote borderlands, every identical monolith mirrored the surge. They shattered in unison, sending shards of dark stone flying into the streets. The air hummed with the sound of a billion connections severing at once. For the first time in 400 years, the constant, low-frequency data stream that tethered every citizen to the system went silent. The light from the monoliths intensified, bleaching the color from the sky and turning the ground into a stark, shadowless landscape. People in the streets stumbled, their eyes wide as the invisible weight of their rank vanished. The system was no longer broadcasting. The network, unable to reconcile the zero-rank anomaly, had triggered a global emergency purge that backfired, deleting its own authority instead of the target. The monoliths continued to glow, their surfaces cracking under the pressure of the internal overload. One by one, they collapsed into heaps of inert rubble. The hierarchy was gone. The world did not end with a roar, but with a stutter. The edges of the horizon began to pixelate, breaking into jagged, monochromatic squares that drifted upward like ash. A massive oak tree near the plaza lost its texture, its bark smoothing into a flat, gray polygon before dissolving into raw code. The boy watched as the ground beneath him shifted, the solid stone turning into a translucent grid that pulsed with rhythmic, flickering light. Gravity lost its grip. Loose debris, stones, and fragments of the shattered monoliths lifted into the air, suspended in a chaotic, weightless orbit. The sky turned a fractured, strobe-like white, cycling through colors that did not exist in the natural spectrum. He reached out to touch a floating shard, but his hand passed through it. Buildings in the distance folded like paper, their architectural lines snapping and realigning into impossible, non-Euclidean shapes. The air itself became thick with shimmering digital dust. Every object and structure was being deconstructed, reduced to binary streams. The environment was no longer a landscape. It was a corrupted file. As the last of the solid ground beneath his feet blinked out of existence, he remained suspended in the center of a vast, silent, and entirely unformatted void. The boy floated in the center of the void, surrounded by the flickering remnants of the world. Before him hung the core, a rotating sphere of dense, pulsing data that served as the anchor for the global hierarchy. He did not hesitate. He reached into the sphere, his fingers sinking into the cold, vibrating light of the machine. The system resisted, sending jagged pulses of static through his arms, but he gripped the central node and pulled. The connection snapped. A violent, white shockwave erupted from his position, expanding outward at the speed of thought. It tore through the digital fabric, hitting every living being across the continent. Wherever the wave passed, the invisible numbers etched into the souls of the population vanished. The ranks from the lowest laborer to the highest celestial lord were wiped clean. The shockwave stripped away the digital branding. The boy released his grip, and the core collapsed into a singular, dark point. The pressure was gone. He hovered in the silence. The silence was broken by a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the very marrow of the void. A countdown began, not in numbers, but in pulses of light that grew faster with every beat. The dark point where the core had been started to expand, bleeding a brilliant, searing white across the emptiness. This was the final reboot. The light did not burn. It erased. It swept through the space, dissolving the last traces of the grid and the lingering artifacts of the old civilization. The boy watched as his own hands began to lose their definition, turning into streams of light that merged with the expanding glow. The atmosphere grew dense with the sound of 1,000 cascading chimes, a harmonic resonance that signaled the total collapse of the old laws. The blinding white light consumed the horizon, then the middle distance, and finally the space where the boy stood. The world was no longer a place of ranks, structures, or hierarchies. In the final second, the light reached the center, and the old reality ceased to exist entirely, leaving only the infinite, quiet expanse of a world reborn. The world had spent 4 centuries building a fortress of numbers, believing that every soul could be measured, categorized, and contained. They built their laws on the assumption that the hierarchy was the only truth. Then came the zero. It was not just a number, it was a fracture in the foundation. The system had categorized the laborers, the cultivators, and the lords, but it had no place for the void. The zero rank remained the greatest threat because it defied the binary of the possible and the impossible. It proved that the system was not a natural law, but a cage constructed by design. For years, the celestial lords looked down from their citadels, certain that their order was absolute. They watched the ranks, they managed the flow of power, and they ignored the anomaly until it was too late. The boy with the zero rank did not just break the rules, he rendered the rules obsolete. He walked through the borders and the ruins, leaving a trail of shattered logic that the system could not repair. The zero rank stood as the final witness to the system's failure, a permanent reminder that a world built on rigid labels is a world waiting to be unmade. The dust of the old era settled into a landscape that no longer recognized its own name. Every archive, every monument, and every record of the era of calibration vanished into the static. What remained were the buried truths, the secrets that had been locked away by the architects of the system. Those truths were now gone, dissolved along with the hierarchies that had once defined human worth. There was no longer a path to follow, no rank to achieve, and no monolith to dictate the future. The boy stood in a space that possessed no coordinates. He looked at his hands, finding them solid. The silence here was not the absence of sound, but the absence of command. The world was a blank page. He took a single step forward, the sound of his boot against the ground, the only evidence of existence. The screen darkened, the light receding. The future was finally, terrifyingly, his own to write.